Okay, so where the bleep am I and preparing to take the shot. So this is a talk on a red team engagement. A lot of people get focused on this is red team, this is this, and we talk about the exploits that we use and how we set things up, but no one ever talks to the younger crowd and says, hey, here's what I actually did. You're going to see the tools and people talk about all the elite things they did, but no one says from start to finish, this was an engagement. So my goal with this talk was to give you a step-by-step, everything that I did to escalate to domain admin. So who am I? I'm the principal security engineer at a little company called Alias, although we're not so little anymore. We've got 3 locations. We're a pen testing boutique out of Oklahoma, but we also have offices in Kansas, Texas, and Virginia. I've got 10 years of professional penetration testing experience, 15 of unprofessional unpaid. The head of reconnaissance and destruction at Alias, head of R&D. My whole job is to find new great ways to break things, whether that's through phishing or incident response, taking what we learned from incident response and then making that actionable in a way that we can use that on a red team or a pen test. And I'm also a magician, which comes in real handy for our social engineering, either disappearing things, getting into things, lock picking. We run the whole gambit from social engineering, incident response, physical, internal, external pen testing, web app, application, mobile. If you've got it, we'll break it. So again, we're covering the 0 to full compromise. This was a red team assessment. I found that most people don't really know what red teaming is or actually want a red team assessment. Maybe they want an external pen or they want what they think is red teaming, but everyone likes the word. Red teaming is adversarial emulation, or APTs. The thing about APT is advanced persistent threat. You can't expect me to be a persistent threat if you give me a weekend to pen test, but I digress. We're going to cover the 0 all the way up. We'll cover scope and then step through everything. All right, so our scope. Your scoping document is your lifeblood. If you don't know what your scope is, you're out of luck. You're going to have a real bad time. You're going to do something you shouldn't, so always know your scope. The scope for this engagement was we are to gain access to the network from an external source. We're to compromise a user account, get access to a domain computer. From there, we were to escalate to domain admin, and then we were to show either a ransomware or an APT style action. So demonstrate full control by deploying malware. It was important that we had to fly under the radar. So we wanted to not give the SOC too many things to jump onto. We also needed to give the SOC something to win by. They didn't want us to be so quiet that there was egg on their face at the end, but they also didn't want us to just go in guns blazing. So our initial access, we're going to start by enumerating the attack surface. And what I use for this is DNS dumpster, and that'll give me their VPN or their IP address for their VPN. I'll take that, I'll plug that into Shodan. I basically do that for every host I find. So DNS dumpster gives you every subdomain, which is a great way to hunt for infrastructure that belongs to them. Your MX record and your TXT records, as well as your DNS servers, are great. DNS servers are going to tell you where things are hosted. Your MX record is going to include their mail servers. And then you're going to have your SPF record. The SPF is great because it will give you the external range of on-site Exchange servers, as well as what mail client they use. So you can see, do they use SendGrid? What are they using to prevent people from phishing them? And you can start tailoring things around. If they use Mimecast, I know these are the attacks I need to do to bypass Mimecast to get my phishing lure in. From there, I move on to a site called LeakPeek. I also use Comb, which is the combination of many breaches. This kind of gives me name and structure of logins, as well as passwords that people are commonly using. So you can see Ginger over here in the corner, and then NetBear, DLD 5004. It tells you where these were located, but it kind of gives you a profile on that person. Not going to really go into the spear phishing portion of like Cobalt Strike. That's a whole different animal. But for this example, we'll say that I snagged some credentials, I identified the VPN, and then it was my time to go to the VPN. So it was an F5 VPN. There was a web portion and there's a tunnel portion. I wanted to test concurrently. So I'll test a Windows machine and a Linux machine. I want to get my Windows box and my Kali box on domain. So if I go to the website, I was able to download the deb. I was able to pull in the F5 deb and then build my tunnel. Here's where it gets interesting. After we had compromised the actual account, and we let our point of contact know, he was nice enough to replace my account that's like jbarrett@companyname.com with an account called Pentester, which I was super grateful for, super low-key, super surreptitious. One of the questions I got was how I'm taking notes for these assessments. I kind of start with a top-down approach. So I use OneNote as my primary, and then I take, as things happen, I say, this is my initial access. So I take my notes as I'm going to write my report. So this is my initial access section. Here's where I started enumerating. When I hit Active Directory, I actually break out a whole section called Active Directory Enumeration, where I include all of my screenshots with, this is the account I used, this is how I did this. I'll kind of walk through that a little further. All of these screenshots are actually from that engagement. So everything that you see here has been sanitized and cleaned up. And these are things that I'm delivering to the customer. All right, so we dropped onto the network. We got in. Where am I? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my Windows machine and IP config. Okay, where am I dropped? I've got this 10.100.26.87 address. But then I've got these DNS servers, 192.168.50.245 and 250.245. So I'll do an nmap on those. We'll start by enumerating those machines. A lot of times you'll luck out and your DNS servers are going to be the same as your domain controller and your life is easy. Unfortunately for me, this domain was huge. This is a 4-letter .net company. So there was a lot. There was a huge forest. There was more than, yeah. So what I had here was port 22, port 53, port 80, and 443. And I see that's info blocks. But what that does is that shows me, okay, info blocks, and then this IP range, it's probably going to be a server subnet. See, no scanning option. Just want to check the chat. If there was a no scanning option. There are some commands that you can use if you're domain joined, and if you want to join that machine to the domain. I think netll test, I can't remember the exact offhand, but it'll give you the domain controller. So that's a way that you can do this without scanning. I also don't recommend these T4s. That will scream to the blue team. So there's this grep b4 open. That breaks everything down so you don't have to scroll through 255 lines of open, close, open, close. Just pipe your scan and then grep for open. That -B4 says anything B4, 4 lines before the word open. So that gives you everything. So we scanned that subnet now, that 50 subnet, and we're looking specifically port 389. That's LDAP. You can look for 636, which is secure LDAP. In my experience, no one ever uses it. Everyone has regular LDAP open. So we've got this internal, live.internal as an nmap server, LDAP, DC3, DC4. If you did not want to scan, your admins are lazy. Pings and NS lookups are almost never found. And if you've got DNS on domain, you can do the lookups. That's why this tab is important. If you can find the DNS server and add the customer's DNS server, then you can use that to do NS lookups against their domain. Again, admins are lazy. So if you want to look for ldap.domain.com or DC1, DC01, DC02, domain controller, it's 5 pings. And eventually it's going to tell you, oh, here it is. The last one is WSMan. This is something I use a lot. It's going to come back later. So. All right, so we found the domain controller. Now what do we do? All right, We're going to use the run as command because I don't have a domain join machine. And run as is going to actually let me put in the user's information that I compromised and then create a token that I can then make queries on behalf like I'm a domain join computer. So I start by running sharphound. Sharphound is the collector for bloodhound. This is going to be really loud. So this is where you have to think about, when am I going to engage this? Do I do this at night? Do I do this maybe in the middle of the day where there's going to be a lot of traffic? How do I avoid alerting the SOC? What I try to do is find the most opportune time, and then I cram everything in at once. If I've got a short time period and I can't have the option to do like a low and slow fly, I'm going to try to knock out as much as I can and give the SOC so much to digest that they can't find me. So we're going to start with sharphound. We enumerate that. It goes out to the domain controller. It dumps every session, every object, every ACL, SPN targets, containers, etc. It drops into the Bloodhound application in Kali Linux. That uses Node4j to actually use graph theory and build attack paths. So the first thing I do is I take the account that I have, and I just want to see what gets me to domain admin. What is my fastest path? So I can see that my account is a domain user. They're admin to this machine, which there's a user that's a domain admin, also has a session on this machine. There are a lot of queries that you can run in here. One example is like find all domain admins. There's an option to actually enumerate all of these as well. These are usually tagged, again, just to sanitize and keep it clean. I went ahead and just disabled edge node display. But this will show me every domain admin, and then I can mark these guys as targets. And actually, this is going to be every non-domain controller that has a domain admin logged in. So that's this query right here. Find domain admin logins on non-domain controllers. So we have our own principal. We know where the domain admin is. All we need to do is own this box, this 82. We have to drop it at user session. And we're in luck because we're domain admin on that machine. Okay, so our first foothold. We RDP into that box. We're going to go ahead and look at Task Manager. We can see here's that user, S whatever, the domain controller. Here's us as administrator. And then we launched an administrator command prompt. So who am I? Administrator. So we have the option of dropping Mimikatz, which would be great, but not super OPSEC safe. So when I get on a machine, I'm actually trying to just, again, fly low and slow. This whole attack path uses no exploits. Think of it as a really malicious admin that you hired. Most of my team is going to work through using Nessus and what exploits they can to elevate up. As I pen test, I don't use exploits. Unless I absolutely hit a brick wall, I'd rather just use misconfigurations. So we don't want to use Mimikatz. We don't want to use seatbelts. These things are typically flagged, but I had to make some option. So I went with PsExec. That's going to be sometimes flagged, sometimes not. So let's take our chances. PsExec allows us to take our administrative session and jump up to system level. From system, then we have full rights to basically do as we choose. PsExec will flag AV, so be careful. But you can see that who am I command, I'm system. I'm going to go ahead and just query all the sessions. So query all the users. So I query the users, which is the same thing that we saw in the task manager. And I see that this administrator that I want, they're on ID 2. You can, as the system, steal or take over a session or inject yourself in. Here's kind of important. If you don't have hands on the keyboard, you want to make sure that you fire back a VNC connection to yourself, because when you run this command, it's going to drop you out of your RDP session. And while the user that was logged in is going to be logged in a session then, or migrated over, you'll lose that connection and you won't be able to RDP back in. So I'm able to drop in, run this command, tscon. This is just with, again, being local admin on that box. Once I run the who am I, you can see I'm now that domain user and I'm a domain admin. From here, most people will take this, they'll dump Mimikatz, they'll use their credential, they'll try to get their credentials. There was an option for remote potato, any number of ways to grab creds to then pivot up to domain controller. You don't have to do that. everyone thinks you have to go right to domain controller. Download RSAT, Remote System Administration Tools, and use ADUC, this Active Directory Users and Computers. This will let you use the session you have logged in. It'll authenticate the domain controller. You never have to know the password. From there, we go to domain admins. We drop ourselves in, and we are now domain admin. That took all of 5 minutes. If you say from start to finish, from engagement to domain admin, once I had the initial logon and the VPN, you're looking at an hour. I don't know if any SOC can really catch that quickly and not still be questioning themselves, especially late at night. Your best guys aren't going to be there. They're going to have to call someone. Okay. Now we've got full domain compromise. So from here, I'm the domain admin. I could RDP. Again, I try to stay under the radar. This is where that WS man comes back in, WinRM. So I'll use WinRM and evil WinRM to get to that machine. Once I get on that machine, there's any number of things that I can load with WinRM. I can drop files. So I drop this a.ps1, and then I execute a.ps1.ntds.dit. ntds.dit is the database that holds all of the hashes for everyone in Active Directory. It's just the NTLM hash. The method that I'm using here, this is an audit script that I use, but essentially what we're doing is we're creating shadow copies. It's just like Hive Nightmare, but we're going to create shadow copies of the ntds.dit. We're going to yank out the registry keys that we need to decrypt them. And then using the secret dumps.py, we'll go through, we'll have all of that converted with the secret codes and the encrypted file into a readable output. So look at me, I'm the domain admin now. Not only am I the domain admin now, I'm everyone now. With the NTLM hash, I can pass off as any user I choose. So if I had a specific resource that I wanted to hit, like HR or banking or finance, I can now pretend to be any of those users. With free RDP, I can RDP as any user. And then with crack map exec, I can actually move around the network as any user. Let's give the blue team some fun now. So I've fully compromised the domain. I've started to have my fun, but I've got 1,300 machines where I'm local admin on, but I've also got a whole domain I now control. So why don't we just go ahead and rain some shells? So I use Covenant as my C2. Generate a payload, and then with the -X option in crack map exec, I can actually push that payload and that stager all across the network. So I'm just spraying shells at this point across /24s. I would love to do /16s and /8s. Unfortunately, crack map exec does not like that, so this minimalizes that. But there's nothing funnier than watching like 800 check-ins into your Covenant C2 server, and you're just praying that your VM doesn't lock. So here you get all of your check-ins. Each one of these is a unique host. And then we have integrity high because we're domain admin. So we have full privileges to do everything. The reason why we are moving into Covenant is we can establish persistence with it and then do any number of things. We can start doing our AMSI bypasses. You can use an AMSI bypass, which is how you would normally get past the AV hooking and that SOC alerting. But instead, we're going to use it here to start loading other things in. It's easier from Covenant, and I think it's just kind of cooler. Safety cats is a good command that we'll use to safely kind of execute Mimikatz. But if we do our AMSI bypass, we can just load Mimikatz directly. Attackers have started using Covenant as the preloader because it's great. And then they use that to then bypass AMSI and then do a shell loader and actually drop either an MS build package or a DLL that is Cobalt Strike and then escalate up to a Cobalt Strike session. So that was the hard way of doing everything. There were actually a lot easier ways. Once we had all the Bloodhound queries, then we could start looking at what do we have. One query that I'll use is passwords stored in Active Directory or passwords not required. So here's an example of a member of domain admins. Password not required is true. You can actually go to any machine that has RDP on that, click on the password box, hit enter, and you're instantly logged in, and now you're a domain admin. Another fatal flaw that we saw is the domain users. Domain users had local admin as a first degree delegated right on 1,324 machines. So even if I was not able to get to domain admin, I could then use this local admin, and using the credentials that I had, I could dump all of these boxes out of Bloodhound, create a file, and then set up crack map exec to then go out and spray everything across here, and then set up a task that would run Mimikatz or start dumping wdigest and start harvesting credentials. I could also use crack map exec to dump all of the passwords off of that. They'll dump wdigest, the LSA secrets, as well as the SAM database. All right, before I jump on the next part, I'll see if there were any questions. So doing this during the night because the best SOC analysts are probably not there. How can a blue team do better? Rotate your staff. Don't make your poor blue team guy work the night shift all the time. Make sure that he's ready to be on the night shift. And there are actually some really hardcore blue teamers that prefer the night shift. So just make sure you have those guys. Make sure that your on-call schedule is good. In this instance, well, not in this instance. In other instances, we've had the monitoring service, say SecureWorks or whoever, try to contact the on-call person because they don't know if this is legit or what's going on. And so they will try to reach out to them, and then they're not available. And so I just keep getting to run free. There was a question of what is Mimikatz? Mimikatz is a beautiful tool that will actually dump credentials. It was based on some work. I think GentleWiki is the guy's primary username. I think it's 10 years old at this point, and version 3 is coming out. But it was a godsend for pen testers because it let us dump the credentials, either whether it be SAM or NTLM, from every user logged into a machine. All right. So we'll jump into the next portion. And this is going to be an interesting non-technical talk. All of my hobbies are mostly technical, so it's interesting to go into one that wasn't. So this is taking the shot, and this is going to long-range shooting. So the guys you see on your screen, this is the PRS series, Precision Rifle series. This is a timed competition where you hit targets, you engage steel plates at known distances, and you're going to try to see how fast you can hit them. The goal is to be the most accurate in the fastest time, while rapidly transitioning between distances. This actually looks really fun. And then when I started the talk and started thinking about the explanations, I realized that, oh my God, I'm giving a math class on Sunday morning. So I apologize for that. There's a lot of math in here. And there's a lot of thought behind it, but it's really interesting when you actually start looking at trajectory and parabola to see what it takes to hit a target a mile away. And before you can shoot fast like these guys, you have to be smooth. So slow is smooth, smooth is fast. So let's look at the environmental forces that are going to affect bullet in flight. So the environmental forces, we've got wind. That's going to affect left, right. If it's behind or in front of it, it's either going to increase the speed of the bullet or slow the bullet down. The temperature is going to affect the air density. So temperature and barometric pressure kind of play together, but they're going to affect how much air the bullet has to push out of the way, as well as mirage, which is heat coming off the ground, which is surprising. You'll actually see, I mean, even when it's 30 degrees outside, you'll get mirage through your scope. You've got your distance and your flight time. We'll cover flight time a lot because that's one of my favorite things. If you're shooting a target at 1,600 yards, your bullet's in the air for 3 seconds. And then gyroscopic spin or gyroscopic drift or spin drift. So there's this Magnus effect where basically as the wind pushes on an object, it creates a wing-like effect. So you get lift, basically like an airplane, where the air going over the top of the wing is slower than the air going over the bottom, which is then causing everything to rise. So there are other forces that can affect the shot as well. Once you get past the environmental, there's the actual in your hand. So first is having a good grip on the rifle. You want to load into your bipod, which is to push into it, seat it firmly against your shoulder, And then you have a rear bag, which you're going to use to squeeze to just get it right in the sweet spot. You can't jerk the trigger. So you absolutely have to follow the trigger guard down and squeeze the trigger as lightly as possible. Your breathing's super important. When you're looking at 1,600 yards, breathing can actually raise the scope up 1 mil, which is 36 inches at 1,000 yards. So you can have 36 inches of differential. That at 1,000 yards, you actually multiply that, and you're looking at 360 yards of differential. You could be missing the target by feet or yards just by breathing and taking the shot at the wrong time. And then you have your barrel temperature, cold bore versus warm bore. So you have cold bore, which is your first shot, but as you're shooting, the barrel will actually warm up. That affects, as heat soaks the barrel, it'll expand the barrel. So your first shot on a warm bore, or your first shot's really great because it's a tight bore. As you warm up that bore, you're going to start getting more spread. So if you're zeroing a rifle and you want consistency and you want to put bullets through the same hole, let the rifle cool down. And then the last one is angle to target. So if you're straight on, that can affect it. But there are also instances where you will be aiming down or you'll be aiming up at a target. And you have to take those into account. There's also rifle cant. So if your rifle is straight up and down, you're fine. Some people have a tendency to lean in their rifle and they'll offset their rifle. I mean, even 5 to 10 degrees changes that parabola of that shot and will make you miss. Talk about our equipment. So the first thing that we use is our rangefinder. So our rangefinder is going to range the distance. You have to know how far you're shooting in order to be able to actively engage that target, because you have to know how you're going to lob the bullet in. Our next piece of kit is a Kestrel. So the Kestrel will measure the air temperature, the air density, your elevation above sea level. Wind speed is super important. And there are also units that will take wind direction. So with our rangefinder, with our Kestrel, we now have our limit, our parameters that we then plug into our ballistics calculator. You have the Hornady ballistic calculator, and we'll go way in depth into these. But this ballistic calculator is what makes your shot. 100 years ago, or maybe 10 or 15 years ago, you had to actually go in and learn all of these. You had to know what to dial to correctly make the shot. And it was thousands of rounds to actually learn how a rifle would perform. And from those, we would build range cards. And so a range card will actually give you known values, and I'll show you guys that a little bit later. So now let's talk about our equipment, our rifle and our bag. These are the most important tools. And without these, we can't get the job done. I mentioned the cold bore versus warm bore shot earlier. This is my primary rifle that I use. Actually, I use a bolt action, but this is the one that I like to train with. This is my favorite rifle. Hand built by me, start to finish. Underneath the handguard, you have this red, it looks like a heat sink. That's exactly what it is. It is a heat sink. So it soaks the heat out of the barrel to make your cold bore, your next shot, better. Your scope, always important. Stock, adjustable stock. Your bipod, that's going to be your base. And then your bag. So your rear bag is your tool that will actually get you on target. If you don't have a good bag and a good set, it's going to be rough. And that's where PRS gets difficult, because a lot of times you don't have a prone position that you can then shoot from, and you're having to move on the fly. And those, again, little variations can cause some issues. So here's our wind and our range card. So this is specifically for this bullet, 147 grains, traveling at 2,695 feet per second. We'll start with the easy one. Forgive me for this terrible old stained picture I had to pull off the internet, but it's the only thing I'd really show you that would demonstrate how wind affects a bullet. So while you'd think maybe you have to correct a little bit, depending on how far or how fast the wind is going, that's going to push where your point of aim is. This guy's actually aiming way off target. Another interesting thing is when you get into valleys or you get into urban situations, you'll see that these ranges and these winds will actually change. So you may get at 500 yards, wind going this way at 5 miles per hour. And then at 1,000 yards, it goes through a valley the other way because it hits a giant rock and it speeds up and goes to 15 miles an hour. You may have to end up doing some math to figure out where they cancel out and then what to do from there. So we'll talk about our come up first and how we actually dial our scope. This is the old way of doing it. So you would say I'm shooting 500 yards. That means I've got to dial my scope 2 notches up. And then for my wind, I've got wind drift. You don't actually worry about that at 500 yards. And then you have your wind speed. So 0.75. And you have your gyroscopic, which is again your jump up. Those weren't super important back then. Gyroscopic, you were just trying to get close. Let's get a little more accurate. So here are 3 breakdowns of the same shot at 1,000 yards. But the only thing that we're going to change is the wind direction and the wind speed. So we're going to start with, and we're using 1,000 yards because that's the easiest way to do the math. So with the wind directly to our backs, you're looking at dialing your scope up. So you're actually adjusting it 8 mrads. And mrad is 3.6 inches at 100 yards, or it's 36 inches or 1 yard at 1,000 yards. So it makes the math really easy. So in order to hit this target at 1,000 yards, we've got to do the math for 8 times 36. That's how high you're aiming over it. Thankfully, you don't have to know aim over. You just dial your scope to the 8.8, and then it's going to put your point of impact as higher than the target. This 0.17 our wind straight behind us. Why do we have windage? That's where we start getting spin drift. And that's where the bullet is, because of the way that it's spinning, is going to cause it to curve. In the same way you put English on a pool ball, it's the same thing with a bullet. The spin is going to cause it to shift. So we're going to move our wind now, and we move it directly to our left. So now it's a crosswind. So at 5 miles per hour, you're looking at aiming 1.11 mrad. So you dial your scope to a 1, which is going to be 36 inches left of the target. And then you see our come up actually changes as well, interestingly enough. There's a difference between this one and this one. It's the exact same shot, except for the speed of the wind is increased 5 miles per hour. So we have more windage. So that means now we're dialing 72 inches left of the target to make sure that we can actually hit the target. So I just got asked, are these done in metric? Yes. And that's where I'm so upset that I had to learn the American and the metric system, because I get confused in yards and meters. So there's a configuration for meters. And then when you start talking about feet per second, or you start talking about speed of sound, that's also measured in meters, which makes things difficult. MRADs is a universal standard though, really. So there's I believe it's, there's a setting so that once you get to 1,000 yards, meters takes into the same easy math as you would for yards in terms of MRADs. But the difference between these that we actually see is this 8.9 versus this 8.4. The wind got faster, so why did we have to adjust our angle up? And it's because we get the Magnuson effect taking over and actually affecting that bullet. When it's hitting the side of that bullet, it's then ramping it up. So you have bullet drop and distance. So we'll take a look at 1,600 yards, which is very close to a mile. 1,760 yards is a mile. So at that distance, let's go with 1,200. So at 1,200, and we take our 6.5 Creedmoor, this gray line. At 1,200 yards, you're looking at 1,200 inches of drop. So if you do 1,200, you divide that by 12, you get 100. 100 feet of drop as the bullet arcs in, right? And now I've got to work out my math. So if we're doing our math to say hit a target at 1,400 yards, we're going to say that is 21 mil. So that's, sorry, 1,600 yards, 3.6 inches per mil. So if that's 21 mil, you're looking at 57.6 mil, right? So 56 times the 21, 1250, and then 12 gives you 100 feet. So you're 100 feet aiming over. I apologize for that math. It was way easier when I was whiteboarding it out. So unfortunately, you're gonna have to trust me on that one. Okay, so we'll talk about actually dialing the scope. We'll go over the anatomy of the scope. You've got your magnification back here. This is your illuminated reticle. Never use it. Here's parallax. Parallax is dealing with focal plane. So how easy or how hard it is for you to see the target. And it's actually justifying and making it a little clearer. So at 500 yards, you're going to dial that to 500, which is then going to clear up your image. Past 500, you dial it to what's called the infinity setting, because past that, it's all the same. Here's where I talked about dialing your MRADs. So you're actually dialing the scope. So if you were shooting at, say, 100 yards, the difference between 12 and 13, that's 3.6 inches. Between the big numbers, say 1 through 10 or 1 through 26, 3.6 inches. So here at 100 yards, you're actually looking at 12 times 3.6, which is some kind of math, maybe 36, I don't know. And then you have MRADs over here, which is your actual measurement. So you can use the MRADs in your scope to measure out where a target is. You could actually use this to calculate where you are, because there are known things that are certain heights. You know how tall a T-post is, how tall a telephone pole typically is, how tall a person is, how far apart something is, the typical length of a car. Those are ways that you can measure it. You can even go down to the size of your plate. If you know you're shooting a 24-inch plate, you can use that as your measurement. When we talk about our MRADs, this is where I mentioned there's a standard configuration for all of them. MRAD gives us a 1,001 ratio. So at 1,000 feet, 1 mil is 1 foot. At 1,000 meters, 1 mil is 1 meter. At 1,000 yards, 1 mil is 1 yard. And at 100 yards, 1 mil is 3.6 inches. So a standard single click is 0.36 inches at 100 yards. And then a full value of a turning to the 1 is 3.6 inches. So that's the easy portion. Or sorry, that's the hard part. Now we have the easy part. Take some time to try to figure out where the targets are. These are all 12 to 24-inch targets. So we have one at like 550, 575, 600, 800, 900. And then the last one's at 1,600 yards. So once you have that, you know your distance, you've done your math, you're ready to squeeze the trigger. See how you did on your test. So you have one target hanging out over here at about 600 or 550 yards. This is 625, 728, 856, 930, and 1,600. And we're doing this because we don't want easy math. We want to make it more challenging for ourselves. It's harder to transition from a 550 to a 625 plate, which makes it challenging. These flat distance shoot makes your math easy for your corrections. And you can see behind every one of these targets, we have a giant mound of dirt. That's actually 2 tons of dirt sitting behind each target, because we're looking for splash. So in the event that you do not see your target hit and you don't hear it, you can see the splash in the dirt. What you're actually hoping for is once you fire, you have 3 seconds of flight time at 1,600 yards. You can actually get on the target. You can see the vapor trail, that the bullet has vaporized the humidity in the air, and then you can watch it splash on the steel plate. What's even crazier than that is at 1,600 yards, you have the flight time, which is 3 seconds to hit a target. But then you have the speed of sound to take into account. So if the wind's blowing the correct direction, you can hear the ding. But what happens is you fire the shot, you hear the crack at your ear, you watch the bullet smack the target, you see the target swing, But then due to the speed of sound and like the Doppler effect, and like when you're watching baseball, you see the person hit the bat or hit the ball with the bat, and then you hear the crack. It takes 4 seconds for the speed of sound to then relay that ding to you. So from the time you pull the trigger until you hear the ding is 7 seconds. Okay, that's everything. Any questions? Let me scroll back through the chat, see if I missed any.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of questions here for you. The first one was going back quite a bit in your talk. So the appropriate TAC-T rate for an actual engagement to avoid alarms. What do you suggest there?
It really depends on how stealthy you want to be. Attack 1 would be slow. They say 2 and 3 is like 2 is going to be the max if you're trying to be really quiet, even that's kind of loud. 3 is courteous. 4 is one of those like if you're doing a whole volume, you could get gigs out of the network. And if you do 5, you're going to saturate every VPN link and everyone's going to hate you. So if you're trying to go low and slow, do single points, target things a little more specifically, and then that TAC 1 or TAC 2.
Okay. And then Steve wanted to know on the other half of your talk, what about calculations being done in metric units? I know we
So
have
I
an
tried
international crowd
to
here.
highlight that, but we can jump back. That's where your metrics will actually translate over. So at 1,000 meters, 1 mil is actually a meter. And then at 1,000 feet, 1 mil is a foot. So you can use those and kind of do your math that way. I prefer inches and feet because you can break them up a little easier. And then I had a question on the name of the competition. It's PRS, the Precision Rifle Series. You can look at around. You probably have a local club within 100 or 200 miles of you where you can shoot out to 1,600 yards. You're not going to pick up and be ready to train and enter competitions, but I recommend starting in the club matches. It's a whole different world when you transition from I'm shooting for fun in my backyard to I'm slinging bullets, and it hurts a lot more because it's $3 a round. With the particular ammo I'm using, you can get cheaper, but sometimes it's $10 a round. So let's see, another question on how long does it normally take on my red team engagements, and it sounds like I compromised domain admin with an hour or two of initial access. It really depends on how good I'm feeling and how bad I want to win. I do a lot of recon ahead of time, so I'm going to sit down. I'm going to go to every speech put on by a presenter or everything that I can glean. I'm going to listen to podcasts. I'm going to go through job descriptions. I'm doing all of my research ahead of time to actually get as much info as I can. So if I know that they have a SOC position open for third shift for the last 8 months, I know they don't staff their SOC third shift, I'm just going to fire. If their CISO has talked about how they've implemented WASA and IP tables rules to then dynamically block anyone that does an nmap or tries to fire Eternal Blue or Shell Shock, then I'm going to be a little safer. We've had engagements that were a red team because someone wanted one that were 4 hours of work on my part. And then I've had engagements that lasted 8 to 12 months where we went through 3 phases where there was an initial access, migrating up, and kind of changing flags and goals along the way.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. That was a really fascinating talk, and we really appreciate you taking the time, especially early in the morning.